He turned away when they called his name, shoulders quivering, a sound breaking from his throat that silenced the entire courtroom. Not a bark, not a growl, something raw, ancient, wounded beyond repair. They had forced him to choose between the only two souls he ever trusted, and he chose. In that moment, the truth no one dared admit flooded the room. Loyalty had limits, even for a heart trained to serve until death. He wasn't just deciding who would win. He was grieving what had already been lost. And the story that brought him here, the betrayals, the promises, the battles no one ever saw was far from over. Stay close, listen carefully, because this is not a story about two people tearing each other apart. This is the story of a soul fighting to heal, long after the war was supposed to be over. If Ranger's journey touched something deep inside you, if you believe some scars deserve to be seen and understood, I invite you to stay with us, like this story if it stirred your heart. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me, where are you reading from, and which moment left you breathless? Your voice is part of this story now. The late autumn wind whispered through the bare branches, weaving a ghostly symphony around the small farmhouse sitting lonely at the edge of town. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the muted hum of the television and the scent of rain-soaked earth clinging to muddy boots by the door. Ethan Hart leaned back in his worn leather armchair, one hand absently resting on the thick fur of Ranger, their 6-year-old German shepherd. Ranger's ears flicked once, alert even in rest, his chest rising and falling in a slow, patient rhythm. Across the living room, Claire Hart moved about quietly, collecting dishes, tidying books, straightening picture frames tilted by invisible tremors of a house that knew too much waiting. On the mantel, above the cold fireplace, stood a framed photograph. Ethan and Claire, younger, sunburned and weary in desert fatigues, kneeling beside a smaller war-hardened Afghanistan 5 years ago. Their last deployment before life bent them into civilians, before they traded gunfire for grocery lists, combat boots for work shoes, before silence grew so thick between them it needed its own room. The TV crackled and changed channels. Ethan barely noticed. His eyes followed Claire's every move, noting the slight hitch in her step, the way her hand trembled just a little when she brushed Ranger's back while passing. Ranger stiffened, ever so slightly under her touch, a flinch so quick an untrained eye would miss it. But Ethan saw, and something inside him coiled tight. Ranger, who once dragged Claire out of enemy fire, who once slept pressed to her side on nights when bombs fell so close they could taste the dust. Ranger, who had thrown himself between her and the shattered world without hesitation, now recoiled at a simple touch. He said nothing. Claire said nothing. The silence, dense and swollen, swallowed the moment whole. Later that night, Ethan found himself alone with Ranger in the backyard. The stars overhead scattered like forgotten promises. He crouched beside the dog, running strong fingers through his coarse fur. Ranger leaned into him, his weight solid grounding. "What's going on with you, boy?" Ethan whispered, his head lifted, golden eyes finding Ethan's face, holding it with an intensity that seemed almost human. Then, a low sound, something between a whimper and a growl, rose from Ranger's chest. His gaze darted toward the house, toward the window where Claire's silhouette moved behind drawn curtains. Ethan's blood chilled. It wasn't just a reaction, it was a warning. The first real warning Ranger had ever given about someone Ethan loved. Ethan rose slowly, his boots crunching against the damp grass. He looked at the house, looked back at Ranger, and for the first time in years, a deep, gnawing fear settled in his gut. Not the battlefield fear of bullets and bombs, but the slow, creeping kind that ate you from the inside out. Because if Ranger, the most loyal soul he'd ever known, was wary of Claire, then what the hell had he missed? The past replayed itself in silent flashes as Ethan paced inside the kitchen. The way Claire had started locking the bedroom door when he worked late. The new scent he sometimes caught on her clothes was sharp, metallic, like hospital antiseptic but different. Her sudden late shifts at the clinic, longer and more frequent, unexplained. The days she returned looking hollowed out, eyes darting to shadows that weren't there. Was it stress, guilt, or something much darker? Ranger's behavior wasn't random, and if Ethan had learned anything in the sandbox, It was that instincts, especially those of a soldier's dog, were almost never wrong. The next morning, Ethan made coffee as Claire came downstairs in her bathrobe, hair still wet from the shower. Ranger was lying by the front door, his body rigid the moment he saw her. Claire gave a soft, coaxing whistle and reached down to pat him. Ranger pulled back, head low, tail tucked slightly under his body. Ethan watched every second of it, his gut twisting tighter. Claire smiled, that tired, weary smile she wore more often lately. "He's been a little off since the storm last week," she said lightly, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "You know how dogs get." Ethan didn't answer. He sipped his black coffee and tasted ashes. Later that afternoon, while Claire was out running errands, Ethan found himself in the spare room, the one Claire always kept locked now. He stood before the door, keys in hand, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Ranger sat beside him, unmoving, waiting. Ethan hesitated, memories flooding him. Claire's laugh under desert stars, the promises they made in the barracks, the dream of a quiet life they fought to earn. But that life felt brittle now, like glass underfoot. He slid the key into the lock. It turned easily. Inside, the room was pristine, almost sterile. A second-hand hospital bed folded against the wall. Metal shelves lined with sealed plastic containers, medical equipment, syringes, vials, all neatly labeled but locked behind glass. Ethan stepped back, breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just storage. This was something else, something secret, something that explained Ranger's fear and maybe, if he let himself believe it, something that explained the slow, quiet unraveling of their marriage. Behind him, Ranger whined low and deep. Ethan closed the door softly, locking it again with trembling fingers. When Claire returned that evening, Ethan met her smile with one of his own. A perfect, practiced soldier's smile, as if nothing had changed. But inside, the battlefield shifted, because now he knew the war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The following week passed like a taut wire strung too tight, humming with invisible strain. Ethan and Claire danced the same polite waltz around each other, exchanging smiles that never reached their eyes, discussing grocery lists and mortgage payments as if the foundation beneath their feet wasn't already crumbling. Ranger's behavior grew increasingly wary. He followed Ethan around the house, eyes sharp, movements guarded, almost mechanical. When Claire entered a room, his ears pinned back slightly, his posture shifting, subtle but unmistakable for anyone trained to notice such things. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything now. One evening, after Claire left hurriedly for a late shift at the clinic, another in a string of nebulous excuses, Ethan found himself standing by the living room window, Ranger sitting silently by his side. Through the pane, he watched Claire's car disappear down the long dirt road that led to town. His gut twisted with unease. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket, whistled low to Ranger, and headed toward his own truck. The drive into town was a blur, headlights slicing through the misty dark, radio off, mind racing. Claire's story had holes wide enough to drive through, but tonight, he needed more than gut feelings and wounded pride. He parked across from the town's strip of offices, killing the engine, his eyes scanning. There, under the flickering neon of McCulloch and Dean attorneys at law, sat Claire's car, neatly tucked between two larger SUVs. Ethan sat back, a hand over his mouth, breathing shallowly. Ranger whined softly from the passenger seat, sensing the tension radiating from his handler like heat waves off blacktop. 10 minutes crawled by. Then the office door opened and Claire emerged, hugging a thick folder to her chest, her head ducked low under the streetlights. She didn't look around. She didn't hesitate. She got into her car and drove away, never noticing the shadow that watched her from across the street. Ethan sat motionless, long after she disappeared, heart hammering. His hands clenched the steering wheel so hard his knuckles popped. He knew that law office, knew McCulloch's reputation. Divorce, custody battles, asset negotiations. That wasn't a place you went because you needed a will updated or a speeding ticket fought. Claire wasn't planning for their future together. She was preparing for war. And she had started long before the first crack appeared on the surface of their marriage. Later, at home, Ethan sat on the back porch with Ranger sprawled protectively at his feet. The night was damp and cold, the stars hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. He sipped whiskey straight from the bottle, the burn dull against the sharper ache in his chest. Ranger's ears twitched. His body stiffened. Ethan followed the dog's gaze toward the house. Through the kitchen window, he saw Claire moving about, organizing papers at the table. He knew without needing to look closer that the folder she clutched earlier now lay open before her. He watched her movements, the careful way she sorted documents, the furtive glances toward the door as if checking to make sure he wasn't nearby. Ranger's growl was almost imperceptible, a low vibration in the night. Ethan set down the bottle, his hands steady now. The hurt was still there, bleeding under the surface, but a soldier knew when emotion had to be put aside for strategy. Claire was preparing her attack, and somehow Ranger knew it too. The next morning, Ethan decided to test the theory. He waited until Claire left for work too cheerfully, too quickly, then called Ranger into the living room. He held up 2 items, Claire's scarf and his own worn ball cap. He laid them on the floor, a few feet apart. Then he gave Ranger the command, sharp and clear. Ranger sniffed the air, tail low, body tense. Slowly, methodically, he approached the cap first, sniffed once and sat down beside it. Ethan nodded. He had expected that. The dog still recognized his scent as safe, familiar pack. He pointed to the scarf. "Seek," he repeated. Ranger hesitated. His body language shifted, hackles slightly raised, ears pinned back. Weight shifted onto his haunches as preparing to retreat. He sniffed the scarf but immediately withdrew, whining low. His paws shuffled backward, away from the object. Ethan's heart sank. In canine training, these reactions were clear: distrust, fear, confusion. Ranger wasn't just reacting to a different scent. He was reacting to an emotional memory tied to that scent. A sense memory, drilled into him from months of missions where hesitation meant death. Somewhere deep in Ranger's survival wiring, Claire had become a variable, a risk. And if a war dog, the same dog who once sensed danger for her, then Ethan had to believe him. The rest of the week unfolded with unbearable slowness. Claire grew edgier, more distracted. She spent long hours locked in the office, fielding mysterious phone calls in hushed tones. Ethan pretended not to notice. He pretended a lot of things now, but at night, lying awake while Claire slept fitfully beside him, he couldn't ignore the ache of betrayal hollowing out his chest like a rotting tree. One night, after another dinner filled with forced conversation and clinking silverware, Ethan caught Ranger staring at Claire with an intensity that bordered on hostile. Not aggressive, no, never aggressive, but watchful. An old soldier assessing threat levels. Ethan's skin prickled. Later, while Claire showered, Ethan searched through her bag. It didn't feel good. It didn't feel right. But he had crossed the Rubicon days ago. He found the folder. Inside, printouts, case files, custody statutes specific to military-aimed service animals. Highlighted passages detailing precedents where ownership of a canine companion was treated similarly to that of a child during divorce proceedings. Custody battles. Not for property, for my family. For Ranger, the betrayal was complete. Claire wasn't just planning to leave. She was preparing to take the only piece of Ethan's heart he had left intact. And worst of all, somewhere deep inside, Ranger already knew he was the prize in a war neither of them had ever wanted to fight. The shower turned off upstairs. Ethan quickly replaced the folder and retreated back to the kitchen. Heart pounding, mouth dry. He sat in the dark, Ranger's steady presence a comfort he could no longer afford to take for granted. Upstairs, he heard Claire humming softly to herself. That was the thing about betrayal. It never sounded like you expected. It didn't crash in with sirens or shouting. It slipped in quietly, on familiar songs and soft footsteps. Ethan sat there, staring into the darkness, while Ranger pressed close against his leg, trembling with an unease that neither of them dared voice out loud yet. The storm gathering, silent, inevitable. The tension inside the Hart household had thickened to the point where even the walls seemed to vibrate with it. Each day felt longer than the one before. Each conversation a minefield of unspoken accusations and cautious half-truths. Claire moved through the house like a shadow, stiff smiles painted on her lips, while Ethan performed the part of the oblivious husband to near perfection. But Ranger refused to play along. He clung to Ethan like a second shadow, trailing his every step, sleeping curled tightly by his side at night. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Ranger would split his time equally, sleeping at the foot of the bed between them or padding silently from one side of the house to the other. But recently, a shift had occurred, subtle at first and then undeniable. It happened one night during a storm that rattled the old farmhouse to its bones. Rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled like an animal just beyond the walls. Claire, never fond of storms, had gone to bed early, claiming a headache. Ethan stayed downstairs, nursing a whiskey and replaying 100 conversations in his mind, trying to find the precise moment when everything began. Ranger lay at his feet, unmoving. Around midnight, Ethan decided he couldn't delay any longer. He trudged up the stairs, muscles heavy with exhaustion. Claire was already asleep, or at least pretending to be curled tightly under the covers on her side of the bed. Ranger followed Ethan up the steps but stopped at the threshold of the bedroom. His body rigid, head low, tail tightly. Ethan frowned, calling him softly, patting the mattress. "Come on, boy, it's just us." Ranger hesitated, then turned, padding back down the hall to Ethan's old recliner in the guest room. Ethan stared after him, heart sinking. For the first time since they'd brought him home from that war-torn land, Ranger had refused to enter a room where Claire slept. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Claire found Ethan asleep in the recliner, Ranger curled protectively at his feet. Her eyes flickered to the scene, her jaw tightening, but she said nothing. She brewed coffee in silence, her movements sharp, mechanical. Ethan pretended to sleep, sensing the storm brewing behind her clipped steps and shallow breathing. They tiptoed around each other for 2 days after that, exchanging polite words only when absolutely necessary. The air between them grew heavier, almost oppressive. Then, one evening, as twilight crept across the horizon, Claire dropped the bombshell. They were sitting in the living room, a football game flickering unnoticed on the television. Claire stood abruptly, moving to the center of the room, her hands twisting the hem of her sweatshirt. Her voice was brittle when she finally spoke. "You should know something about Ranger," she said, not meeting Ethan's eyes. Ethan muted the TV and waited, dread coiling in his gut. Claire exhaled sharply as if forcing the words out before they could claw their way back down. "He bit me," she said. "A few weeks ago, it wasn't bad, it barely broke the skin. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make it worse between us." Ethan sat back slowly, every nerve in his body snapping to attention. "He bit you," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Claire nodded, finally meeting his gaze, her expression a tangled knot of fear, shame, and something else. Something almost defiant. "I reached for his collar to take him outside. He just snapped." She held out her left hand, the faintest scar visible along the base of her thumb. Ethan's mind reeled. Ranger had been through hell. He had faced gunfire, explosions, and chaos beyond imagination. He had been trained to bite only on command or in extreme self-defense. A bite, even a small one, wasn't random. It was a message. He stared at the tiny scar, his heart thundering in his ears. Claire's explanation didn't sit right. Her words didn't match the Ranger. He knew the Ranger who could pull children from rubble without so much as scratching them, who could differentiate between threat and ally with terrifying precision. There was something missing, something she wasn't saying. Claire mistook his silence for disbelief and rushed on. "He's not his fault. He's been stressed. We've all been stressed. I think he's confused." Ethan said nothing, just kept staring at her hand until she lowered it, trembling slightly. The truth was clearer now than ever. Ranger wasn't confused. He wasn't stressed. He was reacting to something real, something that Claire either wouldn't admit or couldn't understand. That night, the division between them grew into a canyon. Claire went to bed alone, the door left ajar as if daring Ethan to follow. He didn't. He stayed downstairs with Ranger, the two of them sharing the heavy silence of men preparing for a siege. At some point past midnight, Ranger stirred, ears pricking toward the staircase. Ethan sat up, muscles tense. Ranger's body stiffened, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. He stood, pacing once in a tight circle, then lay down again with his head on Ethan's boot. The message was unmistakable. Whatever bond had once existed between Claire and Ranger was broken, perhaps beyond repair. And Ethan, torn between love, loyalty, and a gnawing fear he couldn't name, knew deep down that the worst had not yet come. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked under Claire's weight. The storm outside had passed, but inside the Hart home, the real one was just beginning to gather strength. Dark and inevitable as thunderclouds on the horizon. The day they walked into the courtroom, the sky hung low and gray over the town, as if even the heavens had sensed the inevitability of the clash about to unfold. Ethan wore his best suit, the one he hadn't touched since a cousin's wedding 3 years back, its shoulders slightly tighter now, the cuffs more worn. Claire looked immaculate in a navy blue dress, her hair twisted into a severe bun at the nape of her neck, her face a mask of calm professionalism. Between them, tethered to a short leash, Ranger moved with the silent, wary grace of a soldier stepping on hostile ground. His ears twitched at every sound, his eyes scanned every face. He was tense but composed, as if he knew, somehow, that the outcome of this battle would decide the course of his life. The courtroom itself was sterile and unimpressive: wooden benches, scuffed floors, faded flags drooping in the corners. But to Ethan, it might as well have been a battlefield, every glance and whisper a bullet aimed straight at his heart. The bailiff called the session to order, and the judge, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense posture, took her seat. Claire's attorney spoke first, laying out a meticulous argument about Claire's stability, her nurturing home environment, and the importance of consistency in a retired service animal's life. Photos were presented: Claire brushing Ranger's coat, Claire tossing a ball across the backyard, Claire kneeling with Ranger beside her, both of them smiling into the camera as if nothing had ever been broken between them. Ethan listened with a stony expression, hands clasped so tightly on his knees that his knuckles blanched. When it was his turn, his lawyer rose, steady and firm. Ethan provided his own evidence, videos of Ranger following him unprompted from room to room, clips of the dog refusing to enter the bedroom when Claire was present, the incident logs from the last few months showing Ranger's heightened anxiety around Claire's scent, documented changes in behavior compiled with the help of a canine behavioral specialist. Ethan had not come to fight empty-handed. Across the room, Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tapping an erratic rhythm against her chair arm. Ranger sat between their tables, leash still loosely held by the bailiff, eyes flickering back and forth, reading the tension in the room like an old code he remembered all too well. Then came the unexpected. After hearing hours of conflicting testimonies, reviewing mountains of carefully curated images, and cold, sterile reports, the judge leaned forward, steepling her fingers under her chin. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second as they settled on Ranger's tense form. Then she spoke. "In cases involving children," she said slowly, "we often listen not just to the arguments but to the child's preference, when possible. I see no reason why, in a matter involving a living creature who has demonstrated exceptional intelligence and loyalty, we should not at least attempt the same." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd gathered in the back of the courtroom. Ethan's lawyer stiffened. Claire's lawyer protested immediately, citing procedural irregularities and emotional unpredictability. The judge silenced them with a raised hand. "I am not ordering a final judgment based solely on this," she clarified, "for I believe that Ranger's choice, if he clearly makes one, should be considered significant. We owe him at least that much respect." The bailiff looked uncertain, but at a nod from the judge, he unclipped Ranger's leash. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. No one breathed. No one moved. Ethan felt his heart hammering so hard he thought the sound would fill the entire room. Claire sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ranger stood alone now in the space between their tables, untethered, his body low and cautious. His ears flicked back once, his tail hung uncertainly. The judge gestured once subtly, and the courtroom fell silent, waiting. Ethan didn't call out, neither did Claire. The judge had made it clear: no commands, no encouragement, no tricks. The choice had to be pure. Ranger lowered his nose to the ground, sniffing cautiously. He took one tentative step toward Claire, then hesitated, glancing toward Ethan, his eyes sharp, questioning. Ethan fought every instinct screaming at him to reach out, to call his name, to do anything that might sway the dog's decision. but he stayed perfectly still, his hands fisted at his sides, sweat cold against his spine. Claire shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, her body leaning forward. Ranger's head lifted, his eyes narrowing. For a long, painful moment, the entire room hung in the balance. Then, slowly, deliberately, Ranger turned away from Claire. He walked to Ethan. Each step was careful, measured, almost ceremonial. He didn't run, he didn't leap. He simply crossed the distance between them with a steady resolve, sat down at Ethan's feet, and placed his head gently against Ethan's leg. The sound that came from Claire was soft and choked, barely audible. A gasp, a sob, a breath stolen by something deeper than mere defeat. She covered her mouth with one trembling hand, her eyes wide and shining with tears that she refused to let fall. The judge nodded once, a short, decisive gesture, and wrote something in her notes. "It is duly noted," she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "The court recognizes Ranger's clear preference for Mr. Hart." Ethan reached down, his hand brushing against Ranger's ear in a silent thank you, his vision blurring slightly as the tension finally began to slip from his shoulders. But the moment of small victory soured almost immediately. Claire's lawyer stood again, her face pale but determined. "Your Honor," she said crisply, "regardless of Ranger's choice, we have additional evidence to present, evidence that we believe will significantly impact the court's view on Mr. Hart's fitness for sole custody." The judge arched an eyebrow but motioned for her to continue. From a slim briefcase, the lawyer withdrew a manila envelope, thick and heavy. Ethan's stomach dropped. Ranger whined softly, his body pressing closer to Ethan's side as if sensing the shift, the coming blow neither of them could dodge. The envelope Claire's lawyer placed on the table felt heavier than any weapon Ethan had ever faced. The judge motioned for the bailiff to retrieve it, and as the officer crossed the floor, every pair of eyes followed. Every breath in the room seemed to catch, suspended mid-air. Ethan kept his hand on Ranger's back, feeling the slight tremors beneath the thick fur, the minute vibrations that spoke louder than any words. He didn't know what was coming, but every instinct screamed that it wasn't going to be good. The judge opened the envelope with a precise motion and pulled out a stack of photographs. She flipped through them methodically, her expression unreadable, and then handed a few to the attorneys, retaining others for herself. Claire's lawyer cleared her throat. "Your Honor, these images were taken by a private investigator during the past 3 weeks. They depict Mr. Hart engaging in behavior we argue demonstrates emotional instability and potential risk to the animal's welfare." The screen behind the judge flickered to life, and the images projected there made Ethan's stomach knot with sick recognition. There he was, sitting on the back porch at 2 in the morning, a whiskey bottle dangling loosely from his hand, Ranger lying silently at his feet. Another image showed Ethan in town, jaw clenched, fists balled at his sides, staring down someone he barely remembered arguing with outside the grocery store. Yet another captured him asleep in the recliner, Ranger curled protectively but tensely beside him, the two of them isolated in a house that no longer felt like home. Claire's lawyer continued mercilessly. "We contend that Mr. Hart's unresolved anger issues and emotional volatility create an unsafe environment for Ranger. In light of this new evidence, we respectfully request that the court reconsider custody." Ethan's attorney objected, citing context, emotional duress during divorce proceedings, the lack of any incident involving harm to Ranger or anyone else. The judge listened impassively, her gaze flickering between the attorneys and then settling again on Ranger. For a long, heavy moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice that brooked no argument, she said, "Given the conflicting evidence, and given the earlier demonstration, I am compelled to ask Ranger to make his choice once again without any interference." The bailiff unclipped the leash. The room, already breathless, seemed to constrict even tighter. Every muscle in Ethan's body screamed at him to move, to call Ranger's name, to plead or command or somehow tilt the odds back into his favor. Claire sat frozen, hands clasped so tightly that the veins in her wrists stood out stark against her pale skin. The judge spoke, her voice low and clear. "Mr. Hart, Mrs. Hart, remain silent. No gestures, no commands. Let the animal choose freely." The Ranger stood still for a long moment, his body quivering ever so slightly. Then he moved, but not toward Ethan, and not toward Claire. He padded slowly into the center of the courtroom, turned a slow circle and sat down, exactly halfway between them. His posture was rigid, his head lowered, his ears flattened against his skull. He did not look at Ethan, he did not look at Claire. He stared at the floor, unmoving, his whole body radiating a sorrow so raw it silenced even the murmurs rippling through the crowd. The judge leaned forward, confusion flickering across her stern features. She glanced toward the bailiff, who hesitated, then called Ranger's name softly, as instructed by the court. "Ranger," the bailiff said, voice steady. The dog's reaction was immediate and visceral. He flinched as if struck, a sharp tremor running down his spine. Slowly, achingly, Ranger turned his head away from the sound, his entire body curling in on itself, a low, heart-wrenching whine escaping his throat. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't a growl, it was the sound. Ethan could barely breathe. He felt the pain in Ranger's posture like a blade between his ribs. This wasn't loyalty. This wasn't confusion. This was agony. Ranger wasn't choosing because he couldn't. The war inside him was tearing him apart. Claire's eyes filled with tears, she could no longer blink away. Her shoulders sagged forward, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't look like a warrior fighting for custody. She looked like someone who had already lost something irreplaceable. The judge tapped her pen once against the bench, the sharp crack pulling everyone's attention back to her. She studied Ranger, then the two humans he was torn between. Her mouth tightened into a grim line, and she set her pen down with deliberate care. "This court will take a brief recess," she announced, her voice sterner than before, as if needing to armor herself against what was coming. "Both parties will be given time to consider the emotional welfare of the animal involved before we proceed with final arguments." The bailiff reattached the leash to Ranger's collar gently, murmuring soothing words that barely seemed to reach the trembling dog. As the judge exited through the heavy oak doors, the spell broke. People stood, shifting, whispering. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. A storm of speculation and pity buzzed through the room. But Ethan didn't hear any of it. He knelt beside Ranger, his hand barely brushing the dog's back, feeling the tension vibrating through his bones. The Ranger didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone. He just sat there, trembling, a living, breathing casualty of a war neither side could claim to have won. Across the aisle, Claire sank into her chair, staring straight ahead, her hands limp in her lap. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, tapping against the courtroom windows in a relentless rhythm, a reminder that some storms don't announce themselves with thunder. Some simply seep in, quiet and unstoppable, until everything you thought was solid dissolves right beneath your feet. The rain had turned into a downpour by the time the court recessed, hammering against the windows in furious waves, as if trying to wash away the tension trapped inside the heavy wooden walls. Ethan sat stiffly on the hard bench, one hand lightly resting on Ranger's back, feeling the minute shudder still rippling through the dog's tense frame. Across the aisle, Claire sat as still as a statue, her face pale, her hands slack in her lap, her eyes staring at a spot on the floor as if hoping it would swallow her whole. No words had been exchanged. None could fill the cavernous void that had opened between them. As people filed out into the hallway for the recess, Ethan remained seated, his mind a whirl of doubt, anger, and an overwhelming helplessness he hadn't felt since the day they pulled him off the battlefield in Afghanistan. That helplessness broke slightly when a hand touched his shoulder, firm and familiar. Ethan turned sharply, his body tensing automatically, until he registered the face looking down at him, Logan Price. It had been years, but there was no mistaking him. His once boyish features had been hardened by time and scars, his hair flecked with gray, his posture still impossibly straight, the bearing of a man who had seen too much and survived anyway. "Logan," Ethan said, stunned. "What the hell are you doing here?" Logan gave a tight smile, his eyes flicking briefly to Ranger, then back to Ethan. "Heard about the hearing," Logan said, his voice low. "Had to come. Couldn't let it go down like this without you knowing the whole truth." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What truth?" he asked, even though a part of him already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Logan glanced around, lowering his voice further. "You remember Fallujah, that house we cleared near the end?" Ethan nodded slowly. How could he forget? It was one of the worst days of his life. He was a woman and her kid in that house, Logan continued. And a man is a piece of work. He'd been beating the hell out of them before we busted in. Ranger. He looked down at the dog, his voice catching slightly. Ranger saw it, smell it, heard it. We didn't realize until after that he was acting differently around women who raised their voices, moved too fast. We thought it was just trauma from the war, but it was more than that. He associated certain tones, certain movements with danger. Real danger. Ethan's mind raced, fitting pieces together that had never quite aligned until now. Ranger's reactions around Claire, his withdrawal, his trembling, his agonized indecision. Why didn't you tell me this before? Ethan demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. Logan's face hardened. Because we didn't think it mattered. He was fine with you, fine with most people. But now, if he's reacting like this, you need to ask yourself why. Ethan stared at Ranger, his throat closing. He knew the answer. He had known it in his bones long before Logan ever said it aloud. Something had happened. Something Claire wasn't telling him. Logan leaned closer. And there's more, he said, glancing over his shoulder before lowering a small flash drive into Ethan's palm. Check your house cameras, backup servers. She didn't wipe everything as clean as she thought. Before Ethan could react, Logan squeezed his shoulder once, then slipped away into the crowd, disappearing as silently as he had come. The weight of the flash drive in Ethan's hand felt heavier than a loaded weapon. That night, after the courthouse emptied, and Claire disappeared with her lawyer into whispered strategy sessions, Ethan drove home through streets slick with rain, Ranger silent in the passenger seat. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't speak. His mind was a blank slate smeared only with dread. At the house, he moved with mechanical precision, slipping into his study, plugging the flash drive into his laptop. Files loaded slowly, each percentage tick torturous. When the folder finally opened, his heart almost stopped. Dozens of video clips, each time stamped late at night. The security cameras around the house captured moments Claire clearly hadn't realized were being recorded. Ethan clicked on the first file. The screen lit up with a grainy image of the kitchen. Claire stood by the counter, shouting into a phone, her face twisted with rage. She slammed a glass onto the countertop, shattering it, then swept the pieces off with a furious swipe of her arm. Ranger, sitting in the corner, flinched so violently he nearly toppled over. Another file. Claire pacing the living room, screaming at someone unseen him. Maybe, or maybe herself. She threw a framed photo against the wall, shattering it. Ranger whimpered, trying to crawl under the sofa. Another. Claire yanked harshly on Ranger's collar, dragging him roughly outside when he balked at the door. He didn't resist, didn't fight, only froze, his body language screaming submission and terror. Ethan sat frozen, bile rising in his throat. The woman in these videos wasn't the Claire he remembered, the woman he had fought beside, loved, married. She was brittle, broken, dangerous in a way he hadn't allowed himself to see. And Ranger, poor, loyal Ranger, had borne the brunt of that hidden violence. He scrolled through clip after clip, each one another crack in the illusion he had tried so hard to preserve. By the time he reached the final file, Ethan's hands were trembling. It was Claire again, standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up toward the darkened landing where Ethan's and Ranger's bedrooms were. She stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, her face twisted with an emotion then she whispered so soft it barely registered on the audio feed. I'll make sure you never leave me too. The screen went black. Ethan sat in the darkness, the storm outside pounding against the windows. Ranger curled tightly against his side, shivering from a fear that had never truly left him. The truth wasn't just ugly, it was there would only be the truth. Raw, ugly, unavoidable. The morning of the final hearing arrived heavy with a strange, choking stillness. Ethan stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the man looking back at him. His jaw was tight, the lines around his eyes deeper than he remembered. Ranger sat quietly in the doorway, head tilted. Sensing the tremors Ethan tried to hide, the flash drive weighed like a stone in his pocket. Every fiber of his being told him to walk into that courtroom, show the judge the damning footage, and end this battle once and for all. Claire would lose, Ethan would win. But somewhere deeper, something gnawed at him, refusing to let him move forward without hesitation. Driving to the courthouse, the roads were slick with the remnants of last night's storm. The world outside blurred, gray, and uncertain. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening. Ranger whined softly, shifting uneasily on the passenger seat. It wasn't until he pulled into the parking lot that the doubts fully crystallized into something sharp enough to make him stop. What if it wasn't so simple? What if Claire's violence wasn't just a matter of cruelty, but a response, a reaction? Pieces of the past few months began stitching themselves together, threads he had ignored now weaving into a picture he couldn't unsee. He remembered the arguments, the nights he had come home drunk, bitter from the slow death of his career, the isolation of civilian life pressing like a boot against his chest. He remembered the way he would slam cabinet doors, raise his voice just a little too loud when frustration bubbled over. He had never laid a hand on Claire, not once, but emotional wounds could bleed just as deep as physical ones. The Ranger had seen it. Claire had lived it. Ethan sat frozen behind the wheel, a sick realization settling into his bones. Maybe he hadn't been the only victim. Maybe he had been a weapon too unwitting, but no less damaging. In the courtroom, the air crackled with tension. Claire sat at her table, her hands folded neatly, her lawyer whispering urgently into her ear. Ethan's own attorney was reviewing notes, preparing to unleash the footage that would undoubtedly sway the judge. But Ethan's mind was somewhere else entirely. Ranger's leash was slack in his hand, but the dog pressed close, head against Ethan's leg, as if anchoring him against the tide of doubt, threatening to pull him under. The judge entered, stern and sharp, bringing the room to silence. Final arguments were called. Ethan's lawyer rose, poised to introduce the new evidence. Ethan opened his mouth to stop him, but before he could speak, a soft voice broke the silence. "Claire's, Your Honor," she said, standing slowly, her voice trembling but clear. "Before new evidence is introduced." The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Proceed." Claire turned, facing not the judge but Ethan directly. Her eyes were glassy, brimming with an ocean of grief and anger, and something heartbreakingly vulnerable. "You think I was the only one who broke things," she said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "But you were there too, Ethan. Every slammed door, every night you disappeared into a bottle, every time you shouted just to feel alive, you tore pieces out of me. You didn't need to hit me to leave bruises." A ripple went through the courtroom, murmurs quickly hushed by the bailiff's sharp look. Ethan sat frozen, every word striking harder than any blow he had ever taken in combat. Claire continued, her voice cracking at the edges. "I never wanted to take Ranger away from you. I needed something that didn't hurt. Something that reminded me I wasn't crazy, that my fear wasn't just in my head." The judge leaned forward slightly, her face unreadable, weighing every word. Ethan couldn't look away. Shame and understanding warred inside him, tearing at the remnants of the man he thought he was. Then, in a moment that shattered what little composure Ethan had left, Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. She opened it carefully, flipping through pages until she found what she needed. "This," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is from my therapy sessions." She handed it to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. "It's dated," Claire said, "months before I ever spoke to a lawyer. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted to feel safe again." The judge skimmed the pages, her expression tightening. Ethan's hands trembled, but he forced himself to sit still, to listen. The next revelation came not from Claire but from Ranger himself. As Claire stood there, speaking her truth, Ranger whined a high, keening sound and pulled slightly against the leash. Ethan let him. Ranger crossed the short distance to Claire and nudged her hand with his nose, a low whimper vibrating from his throat. The courtroom gasped. Even the judge's eyebrows rose. Claire dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around Ranger's neck. Silent sobs shook her frame. Ranger stayed perfectly still, a living shield against a world that had hurt them both. And then, without prompting, the courtroom's projector flickered to life again. This time, it was a clip Ethan hadn't seen yet, buried deeper in the files Logan had given him. A moment from months ago. The living room. Ethan's voice raised in frustration, demanding answers Claire wasn't ready to give. Claire, backed into a corner, her hands up in a futile defense. Ranger stepped between them, pressing against Claire's legs, barking sharply until Ethan's voice broke, his anger crumbling under the force of the dog's silent plea. Ethan stared at the footage, his face draining of color. He had been the threat once. He had been the one Ranger had protected her from, and he hadn't even seen it. The judge cleared her throat, pulling the room back from the brink. Her gaze moved from Ethan to Claire, then down to Ranger, whose tired body trembled between them. "Enough," she said quietly. "This case is not what it appeared to be." But before she could continue, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open violently, a figure striding in, rain-soaked and wild-eyed, carrying another piece of the past neither Ethan nor Claire was prepared to confront. The doors slammed against the back wall of the courtroom, startling everyone to their feet. A deputy stepped forward instinctively, but the figure entering raised empty hands in surrender. It was Logan Price, again soaked through with rain, his breath ragged from running, but his eyes clear and determined. "I have something the court needs to hear," he called out, his voice steady despite the tension vibrating through the room. The judge leaned back slightly, considering, then gave a short nod. "Proceed," she said. Logan glanced at Ethan, then Claire, then down at Ranger, who watched him silently, ears twitching once in recognition. "Neither of them should have to make this choice," Logan began, stepping to the center of the room. "Neither should Ranger." The silence was absolute. Logan continued, his voice low but clear. "Dog, this soldier, has spent his life serving, saving, choosing sides in battles he didn't ask for. He deserves more than to be torn apart by this." His gaze softened, landing on Claire first. "You loved him," he said simply. Then he turned to Ethan. Claire's hands trembled at her sides, but she stepped forward without hesitation. Her face was pale but firm, her shoulders squared with a quiet strength Ethan hadn't seen in months. She turned to the judge, her voice breaking slightly but never faltering. "Your Honor," she said, "I am withdrawing my petition for custody." A collective gasp rose from the courtroom. Claire pressed on. "This isn't about winning or losing anymore. It's about what a Ranger needs. And right now, he doesn't need a battlefield." Her voice cracked, but she smiled through it. The kind of smile born not from victory, but from the deepest, hardest kind of love. The kind that lets go. The judge tilted her head slightly, studying Claire as if seeing her for the first time. Ethan's chest constricted painfully, but before he could speak, Claire turned to him, their eyes locking across the chasm of heartbreak and history that lay between them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "not just for the courtroom, but for every night gone wrong, for every scream swallowed, for every hope abandoned." Ethan opened his mouth, 1,000 words scrambling for release, but the judge held up a hand. "Mr. Hart," she said, "given Mrs. Hart's withdrawal, custody would ordinarily revert to you. Do you wish to proceed?" Ethan stood there, feeling the weight of everything pressing against his memories. Guilt, love, and something heavier than all of it, clarity. He thought about Ranger, trembling in the middle of that courtroom, paralyzed by the impossible choice he had been forced to make. He thought about the nights he had sat alone, anger gnawing at his bones, blind to the way it had bled into every corner of their lives. He thought about Claire, not as an adversary but as a mirror, reflecting all the cracks he had refused to see. Slowly, Ethan shook his head. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice hoarse but sure. "I'm not the right choice either, not right now." The judge's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Are you refusing custody, Mr. Hart?" Ethan nodded. "I am." A stunned silence fell over the room. Even Ranger seemed to freeze, his gaze flicker between Ethan and Claire with something like confusion. "I love him," Ethan said, his voice steadying as he spoke. "But love doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it means making sure he gets the peace he deserves." He took a breath, turning slightly to gesture toward Logan, who stood motionless near the back of the room. "I would like to nominate a third party for custody. Someone who knows what Ranger's been through. Someone who can give him the life he needs without the ghosts we've wrapped around him." The judge leaned forward, interest sparking behind her professional mask. "And who would that be?" Ethan looked at Logan, who met his gaze without flinching. "Logan Price," Ethan said firmly, his former handler, his brother in arms. A murmur rippled through the audience, But Ethan ignored it, focused solely on the flicker of hope that lit up in Ranger's tired eyes. The slight, almost imperceptible wag of his tail. Logan stepped forward cautiously, removing his cap, his soaked hair plastered against his forehead. "If the court will allow it," he said simply, "I'd be honored." The judge sat back, steepling her fingers under her chin, weighing the unprecedented request. Ethan could feel every second stretching into eternity. Ranger sat motionless between them, his gaze calm for the first time in weeks, as if sensing a shift in the winds of fate. Claire wiped her eyes, her hands trembling. Ethan reached out instinctively, touching her arm lightly, an olive branch across the broken ruins of their shared past. She looked at him, surprise flashing in her red-rimmed eyes, and for a fleeting moment they weren't adversaries. They were just two broken people trying to do right by the only innocent one among them. The judge finally spoke, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "This is highly irregular," she said, but her gaze softened slightly. "However, given the circumstances and the overwhelming evidence of emotional trauma suffered by the animal in question, the court is willing to consider the proposed arrangement." A breath Ethan didn't know he had been holding slipped from his chest. But before any final decision could be made, the judge tapped her pen sharply against the desk. "He will, however," she said, "be conditions attached, evaluations, monitoring, formal adoption proceedings if Mr. Price is found fit." Ethan nodded without hesitation. Claire mirrored him, the corners of her mouth turning upward in the faintest, saddest smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, the battlefield between them dissolved, leaving only the battered remains of something that had once been beautiful. As the judge prepared to call the recess and finalize the hearing, Ranger rose to his feet, his body still trembling slightly but his eyes clear, steady. He crossed the short distance to Logan and sat down firmly at his side, pressing his head into the man's thigh with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his soul. The sight broke something loose in Ethan's chest, something that hurt and healed all at once. And just as the gavel was about to fall, signaling the end of one war and the beginning of something new, the heavy courtroom doors swung open again. Just as the judge was about to bring the gavel down, freezing everyone mid-motion. The air shifted instantly, the kind of invisible ripple that moves through a room when something monumental is about to unfold. A figure stepped into the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, his presence so commanding that the chatter in the gallery died away without a word. His uniform, though civilian now, bore the unmistakable sharpness of a military man who had never quite shed the battlefield from his bones. His salt and pepper hair was cropped close, his face weathered and deeply lined, but his eyes, those sharp, steel-gate eyes, missed nothing. Colonel David Monroe. Ethan recognized him instantly, the same way a soldier recognizes the one voice that could cut through gunfire and chaos in the field. Claire's eyes widened, a hand instinctively rising to her chest. Logan straightened, his jaw tightening. Even Ranger pressed close to Logan's side, tensed, his ears perking up, his entire body vibrating with recognition and something close to reverence. The judge peered over her glasses, clearly unamused. "And you are?" she asked, her voice clipped. Colonel Monroe stepped forward, his boots clicking against the polished floor. "Colonel David Monroe, retired United States Army, former commanding officer of the K-9 Tactical Unit Operation Sentinel." He spoke with the kind of clarity that brooked no interruption. "I'm here because this decision is bigger than a custody dispute. This soldier deserves more than any of you realize." Ethan found himself holding his breath, heart pounding. Colonel Monroe turned to the judge directly. "With the court's permission," he said, "I would like to offer testimony regarding Ranger's service record, his condition, and why neither of these parties, though good people, may be the best fit for his future." After a moment's hesitation, the judge nodded slowly. "Proceed, Colonel, but be brief." Monroe inclined his head respectfully, then turned his full attention to the room. His voice, when he spoke again, was low but carried the weight of decades of command. "Ranger served 3 tours overseas. I led most of his missions personally. He wasn't just a tracker, he was a lifesaver. We lost men when we didn't listen to him, and we lived when we did. But like many of us," he paused, his gaze sweeping the room, He came home carrying invisible wounds. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Monroe pressed on. Ranger exhibits advanced symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, more severe than anyone here has documented. His triggers are deeply embedded, tied not just to sounds or smells but to human emotional states. Anger, fear, despair. He absorbs them, reflects them. When his environment fractures, so does he. Ethan swallowed hard, a knot forming in his gut. Claire's hands trembled where they rested on the table, her knuckles turning white. Logan stood still, his face grim, absorbing the words like blows. Monroe continued, his tone softening slightly. Most of you have seen Ranger's loyalty, his bravery, but what you haven't seen is the cost, the nightmares, the tremors, the way he shuts down when he senses conflict he can't fix. You saw it here in this courtroom, sitting between you, torn, unable to move. That wasn't confusing, that was traumatic. He stepped closer to the bench, lowering his voice. Ranger needs more than love. He needs structure, routine, professional support, a calm environment with handlers trained in canine trauma rehabilitation. Without it, he will deteriorate fast. The judge leaned back slowly, tapping her pen against the desk in thought. Monroe wasn't finished. He turned, facing Ethan and Claire fully. You both loved him, he said, his voice carrying a rare tenderness. That's not in question. But loving a wounded warrior is not the same as saving him. Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when to let someone else take the lead. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I'm here, Monroe said, because I'm prepared to offer Ranger a home, a real one. My property is already certified for canine rehabilitation. I work with veterans and retired service animals every day. I can give him what he needs, not just to survive but to heal. The room sat in stunned silence. Ethan's mouth went dry. He looked down at Ranger, whose body had slowly uncoiled during Monroe's speech, whose tail thumped once, uncertain but hopeful. Claire pressed trembling fingers to her lips, blinking rapidly against tears. The judge folded her hands together, her gaze shifting between Monroe, Ethan, Claire, and Logan. This complicates matters, she said finally, but given the unique circumstances, I am inclined to consider it. Mr. Hart, Mr. Price, do you object to Colonel Monroe assuming custody, pending formal evaluation? Ethan shook his head without hesitation. Claire followed suit, wiping at her cheeks. Logan merely nodded, a ghost of a smile flickering across his weathered face. The judge tapped her pen once more, the sharp crack echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot. Very well, she said. Colonel Monroe will be granted temporary guardianship, subject to standard evaluations and oversight. Final adoption proceedings to follow, pending successful completion. The relief that swept through the room was palpable, a collective exhale that seemed to lighten the very air. Ranger stood slowly, his joints stiff, and crossed the floor with careful steps, stopping directly in front of Monroe. The colonel knelt, reaching out a weathered hand. Ranger sniffed once, then pressed his forehead into Monroe's chest with a long, shuddering breath, as if laying down a burden too heavy to carry alone. Ethan turned away slightly, blinking rapidly while Claire wiped her face with shaking hands. It wasn't a victory, it wasn't a defeat. It was something deeper. It was mercy. The judge called for a brief recess, but no one moved at first. The world, for one suspended moment, had righted itself. Yet even as relief settled over the courtroom, Monroe's next words sent a ripple of unease through the air. Still kneeling with Ranger's head cradled against him, Monroe spoke without looking up. There's something else the court should know, he said quietly. Something I found in Ranger's old deployment records. Something that might change how you see everything that's happened. Colonel Monroe's revelation about Ranger's old deployment records unfolded quietly, almost anticlimactically compared to the storm that had raged inside that courtroom for weeks. The records showed that Ranger had been exposed to trauma levels beyond those typically faced even by combat canines. That his loyalty had been weaponized repeatedly until what remained was a creature more devoted to protecting others than preserving himself. It wasn't negligence or cruelty that had cracked him. It was service, duty, and love pushed past the limits of any living being. As the judge finalized the paperwork granting temporary custody to Colonel Monroe pending a formal adoption, Ethan and Claire sat side by side in silence, neither able to speak, the weight of everything they had survived pressing down on them in quiet, unrelenting waves. When the gavel finally fell, signaling the end, it didn't feel like a victory or a loss. It felt like a funeral for something sacred they had tried so hard to protect and failed. They left the courthouse separately, but paused outside under the gray sky, the rain reduced now to a soft mist, clinging to their skin like a benediction or a final goodbye. Ethan stood awkwardly, hands shoved deep into his pockets, while Claire hugged herself against the chill, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other not as adversaries, not even as lovers lost, but as two wounded souls who had done the best they could with the broken pieces they were given. It was Claire who spoke first, her voice so soft Ethan almost missed it over the sound of the damp breeze. "You should do something," she said, not meeting his eyes. "For them, for others like him." Ethan frowned slightly, confused, but then understanding dawned, warm and painful. She wasn't talking about themselves. She was talking about the other Rangers, the forgotten soldiers, the silent survivors. He nodded once, sharply, feeling the truth of it lodge deep inside his chest. Over the next few weeks, they worked together not as husband and wife, but as comrades in arms, building something that mattered from the ruins of what they had lost. They established a fund, the Ranger Homecoming Foundation, dedicated to providing rehabilitation, medical care, and peaceful retirements for military K-9s returning from service. It started small, fueled by their own money, a few generous donations from friends who understood. A lot of late nights filled with awkward silences and unexpected laughter as old habits resurfaced in better ways. Word spread faster than they anticipated. Articles were written, interviews given, donations trickled in, then poured, as people resonated with the raw, aching need behind the cause. Ethan and Claire saw each other often during those months, their conversations awkward at first but gradually growing easier, marked by a new kind of honesty that had been absent during their marriage. They talked about Ranger, about what he had meant to them both, about the parts of themselves they had failed to see when it mattered most. Slowly, cautiously, they built something fragile but real, a friendship tempered by fire, forged by loss. When the day came for the Foundation's first official event, a small ceremony to grant the inaugural funding for the next wave of retired K-9s, neither Ethan nor Claire expected it to be anything more than a formality. The venue was modest, a veterans' hall hung with faded flags and polished wooden floors, the scent of old leather and linseed oil filling the air. Friends, fellow soldiers, families, and supporters gathered, their faces lined with the kinds of stories that needed no telling. Colonel Monroe was there, Ranger by his side, the dog's coat sleek and shining, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes brighter than Ethan remembered seeing in a long time. As the speeches ended and the applause faded, Monroe led Ranger to the front of the room, pausing beside Ethan and Claire as the first ceremonial check was presented. Ethan stood stiffly, unsure, every muscle in his body tight with memories he couldn't quite suppress. Claire hovered beside him, her hands twisting nervously. Ranger sat patiently between them, his head tilting slightly as if reading emotions the way most people read headlines. For a moment, time seemed to stretch unbearably thin, the hum of conversation dimming, the soft creak of chairs, the rustle of jackets, all fading into background noise. Then, without warning, Ranger moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, nudging his massive head first against Ethan's hand, then against Claire's, pressing firmly as if anchoring them both to the moment. Ethan froze, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur against his palm, the tremor that ran through him entirely his own. Claire gasped softly, her hand trembling where it rested on Ranger's head. And then, in a gesture so small it might have been missed had the entire room not been holding its collective breath, Ranger leaned in and licked Claire's hand. Once, gently, then turned and did the same to Ethan. It was not a dog's sloppy kiss. It was something quieter, heavier, an absolution, a benediction, a way of saying, "We survived." The room erupted into soft, tearful applause, the kind that doesn't celebrate victory but honors survival. Claire laughed through her tears. The sound cracked and beautiful, and Ethan found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in what felt like forever. They stood there, bound together not by marriage or anger or regret, but by something harder to define and infinitely more enduring. The shared love for a creature who had given them everything and asked for nothing except the chance to stay by their sides. As the ceremony wound down and people began to leave, Ethan and Claire lingered, talking quietly, awkwardly about the future, the foundation, the next steps, the lives they might help heal. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and the sky had split open into the softest shade of blue, the first rays of sunlight piercing the clouds like fragile new promises. And somewhere deep inside Ethan's battered heart, something began to mend, slow and sure, the way old scars stop aching when the weather finally breaks. If this story moved something deep within you, if you found yourself holding your breath alongside Ethan, Claire, and Ranger, don't forget to like this piece and subscribe for more journeys that cut straight to the heart. I would love to hear your thoughts. Which moment struck you the most? Was it the courtroom silence, Ranger's impossible choice, or the final act of forgiveness? And tell me, where in the world are you reading this story from? Drop a comment below and be part of this story's journey across hearts and cities.